Imagine the terrifying, earth-shaking roar of 50,000 wild men echoing violently through the freezing, suffocating darkness of an ancient European forest. You are standing in the wet, freezing mud, surrounded by a massive, chaotic horde of highly aggressive barbarian warriors who are desperately hungry for blood, personal glory, and the total destruction of civilized order. They are physically massive, heavily tattooed, fiercely independent, and fueled by a deeply primal, entirely uncontrollable, animalistic rage. They blindly swing extremely heavy, jagged iron axes and unwieldy broadswords with terrifying, bone-crushing power. To the normal modern mind, influenced by romanticized Hollywood movies and exaggerated heroic legends, this chaotic, screaming tide of raw human muscle seems absolutely unstoppable. Ordinary people naturally assume that the biggest, strongest, and most fiercely aggressive individual warrior will inevitably always win the brutal physical fight. But when you look incredibly closely at the cold, brutal, unvarnished reality of ancient military history, this terrifying barbarian nightmare was consistently and systematically dismantled by a deeply unnatural force that did not rely on individual heroism, wild battle cries, or animalistic rage. They were completely crushed by the cold, emotionless, deeply methodical, and intensely mechanical meat grinder of the Roman Empire. The average Roman legionary was usually physically shorter, significantly less muscular, and completely devoid of the wild berserker fury that defined his chaotic enemies. Yet he systematically slaughtered them by the hundreds of thousands, painting the dark ancient forests and rapid freezing rivers entirely red with thick barbarian blood. To deeply understand exactly how and why a highly civilized, regimented army of remarkably average-sized men repeatedly annihilated the most terrifying tribal warriors of the ancient world, you have to completely forget everything you think you know about ancient warfare. The Romans did not fight like normal, emotional men desperately seeking glorious combat. They fought exactly like a heavy, soulless, fully industrial harvesting machine, engineered for the exclusive purpose of mass human extermination. Before we step directly into the freezing mud of the dark forest and surgically break down the terrifying mechanical reality of how the Roman legions butchered the chaotic barbarian hordes, hit that subscribe button. We relentlessly uncover history's darkest, most brutal realities every single week, stripping away cinematic myths to show you the horrific, unvarnished truth of ancient warfare. Join the rigid ranks, tighten your heavy leather straps, and let us march into the freezing storm. The absolute horrifying reality of Roman military supremacy began long before a single iron sword was ever drawn from its heavy leather scabbard. While the wild barbarian tribes heavily relied on chaotic, disorganized surges of sheer emotional momentum, the deeply pragmatic Roman war machine entirely relied on the terrifying, unbreakable power of heavy physical engineering and absolute, suffocating logistics. Amateurs endlessly discuss battlefield tactics, but terrifying professionals solely discuss complex logistics, and the Romans were the ultimate, unrivaled logistical masters of the entire ancient world. At the very end of every single exhausting, grueling day of marching through hostile, heavily forested, completely unmapped enemy territory, the Roman legion did not simply drop their heavy military gear and haphazardly go to sleep on the damp ground like their enemies. Despite being physically exhausted deeply starved, and heavily weighed down by 30 kilograms of heavy iron and wood, every single Roman soldier immediately transitioned from a heavily armored killer into a highly disciplined, completely tireless industrial construction worker. In a matter of just a few incredibly short, highly synchronized, and deeply mechanical hours, they completely transformed the wild, untamed barbarian landscape into a highly fortified, completely impenetrable military fortress. They aggressively chopped down thousands of massive ancient trees, dug incredibly deep, geometrically perfect defensive trenches into the hard earth, and constructed heavily reinforced wooden palisade walls that completely surrounded their massive army. To the fiercely independent barbarian warrior, watching this terrifying, highly systematic process unfold from the freezing shadows of the dense tree line was a profoundly demoralizing, psychologically shattering experience. They watched in absolute, completely silent horror as thousands of highly disciplined men violently ripped apart the sacred ancient forest and flawlessly built a massive, mathematically perfect wooden city directly in the very center of their own ancestral lands in a single afternoon. This heavily psychological warfare aggressively communicated an absolutely terrifying message to the tribal mind. It demonstrated that the Romans were not just a simple raiding party looking for a quick fight. They were an unstoppable, permanent, geological force of physical nature that was methodically suffocating the life out of the dark forests. The barbarian tribes desperately tried to launch wild, emotional, surprise night attacks against these fortified Roman camps, fully expecting to catch the soldiers unprepared and vulnerable. Instead, they violently crashed headlong into a perfectly constructed, completely impenetrable wall of sharpened wooden spikes, deep ditches, and intensely awake Roman sentries entirely devoid of any human panic. When the deeply inevitable, highly brutal physical clash finally occurred on the freezing, blood-soaked battlefield, the completely wild, unorganized barbarian horde inevitably rushed aggressively forward in a massive, terrifying tidal wave of chaotic, unbridled physical human emotion. The Romans responded to this deeply terrifying, violently chaotic charge with absolute, suffocating, entirely unnatural silence. The legionaries firmly planted their heavy, iron-studded boots deeply into the freezing mud, tightly locking their massive, curved wooden scutum shields securely together to instantly form an incredibly heavy, perfectly geometrical, completely impenetrable solid wall of thick wood and cold iron. When the screaming, deeply enraged barbarians closed into the exact, highly calculated striking distance, the cold, completely mechanical Roman meat grinder officially and violently activated. In absolute, flawless, completely synchronized unison, the deeply silent Roman front line violently hurled thousands of heavy, specially engineered iron-tipped javelins, the incredibly deadly Pilum, directly into the surging crowd of exposed human flesh. These heavily weighted, uniquely designed weapons were not merely thrown to simply kill the charging enemy. They were brilliantly engineered to intentionally bend and heavily deform immediately upon brutal physical impact. When the heavy, highly sharpened iron tip pierced through a barbarian's wooden shield, the incredibly soft iron shaft behind the sharp point violently buckled and completely bent under the massive weight of the thick wooden pole. This incredibly ingenious, deeply terrifying design completely prevented the furious barbarian from ever pulling the heavy Roman weapon out of his wooden shield. The dragging weight of the deeply embedded iron javelin instantly rendered the barbarian's primary source of physical defense entirely and utterly useless in the fiercely crowded press of intense combat. The highly traumatized, completely disarmed barbarian was now forced to drop his ruined wooden shield, instantly exposing his naked, highly vulnerable chest to the entirely silent, heavily armored Roman line. As the disorganized, completely exhausted, bleeding horde finally crashed into the immovable wall of Roman iron, they suddenly, horrifyingly realized that they had absolutely no physical room to aggressively swing their massive, unwieldy iron broadswords. The heavily compacted, deeply claustrophobic physical environment completely nullified the overwhelming physical strength and chaotic momentum of the towering giants. The entirely unfeeling Roman legionary, keeping his massive shield pulled perfectly tight against his chest, simply stepped aggressively inside the highly clumsy reach of the massive barbarian weapons. Using the incredibly short, immensely thick, double-edged iron Gladius, the deeply silent Romans executed highly calculated, brutal upward thrusts directly into extremely soft, exposed human stomachs and vulnerable throats with terrifying, unfeeling, strictly factory-like precision. The absolute, final, and most deeply terrifying, profoundly psychologically destructive element of the entirely cold, highly mechanical Roman military meat grinder was their complete, absolute, and highly unnatural immunity to extreme physical exhaustion and deep human panic. While the incredibly massive, highly emotional, deeply enraged barbarian warriors fought intensely as fiercely independent individuals, wildly expending every single ounce of their massive physical energy in the first few chaotic, deeply violent minutes of brutal hand-to-hand combat, the entirely silent, highly robotic Roman legions operated completely and flawlessly as a single, completely unfeeling, deeply unified industrial machine. The deeply grueling, incredibly brutal physical act of violently hacking through heavy human bone and dense muscle is intensely exhausting. When the exhausted barbarian warriors inevitably began to severely tire, their heavy iron weapons suddenly becoming impossibly heavy in their deeply blood-soaked hands, they fully expected the equally blood-drenched Roman soldiers to also instantly slow down and violently gasp for freezing air, just like normal mortal men. But the Romans did not fight like normal men. When the deeply engaged Roman front line finally grew physically tired from the sheer, burning exertion of repeatedly and violently butchering human beings, a single, incredibly sharp, intensely clear, high-pitched metallic whistle was blown aggressively loudly by the commanding centurion over the utterly chaotic din of the bloody battle. In perfect, deeply terrifying, completely synchronized harmony, the heavily exhausted front line of men seamlessly stepped carefully back into the tightly packed formation. Instantly, completely fresh, fully energized, highly aggressive, totally uninjured Roman soldiers seamlessly stepped directly forward from the untouched rear ranks to violently continue the horrific slaughter without losing a single, terrifying second of aggressive forward momentum, or giving the panicked enemy even a fractional moment to breathe. To the exhausted, horrified, heavily bleeding barbarian horde, frantically looking at a suddenly brand new, completely fresh, uninjured, utterly terrifying wall of unfeeling red shields and aggressively thrusting iron swords. This was the absolute, ultimate, psychologically shattering breaking point. They instantly profoundly realized that they were not fighting an easily exhausted army of normal men. They were desperately, entirely, hopelessly fighting an infinite, deeply unfeeling, completely tireless, relentlessly highly mechanical factory of guaranteed physical death. The fierce, screaming barbarian courage completely violently shattered and totally irreversibly broke against the cold, unyielding, entirely immovable anvil of absolute Roman discipline. The incredibly bloody, completely freezing northern European forests were completely silenced, not by the wild bravery of giant heroes, but solely by the cold, deeply methodical, heavily standardized, highly relentless, and totally unstoppable, entirely emotionless industrial slaughter of the Roman iron meat grinder.